Bill and Katie's decision to pursue adoption did not arrive as a sudden, sentimental impulse, nor was it a gesture meant to erase the scars of the past. It emerged slowly, painfully, from the long aftermath of a family history marked by obsession, loss, moral compromise, and the quiet devastation left behind by Will, Luna, and the name Spencer itself. For years, Bill had believed that control was the closest thing to love he could offer, that providing protection and resources was enough to compensate for emotional distance and the damage his choices inflicted. Katie, on the other hand, had lived on the other side of that illusion, loving fiercely, leaving decisively, and returning only after learning that survival sometimes required redefining what forgiveness looked like. When they spoke of adoption, it was not framed as redemption, but as responsibility, an acknowledgement that the past could not be undone, only answered. The idea of welcoming a child into their lives carried a strange calm with it, a rare sense of steadiness, after years of chaos. For Bill, the prospect stirred something unfamiliar and unsettling, hope that did not depend on dominance or victory. He had lost Will not in body, but in trust, watching helplessly as his son became entangled in choices that spiraled beyond anyone's control. Luna's tragedy had left a deeper mark, one that Bill rarely spoke of, because it forced him to confront the limits of his power. Her pain had unfolded in the shadow of his influence, tied to the Spencer name whether he acknowledged it or not. Adoption, then, was not about replacing what was lost. It was about offering safety where it had once been denied, about choosing to protect without owning, to guide without shaping another life into a reflection of his own failures. Katie approached the process differently, with caution sharpened by experience. She understood the emotional weight of bringing a child into a fractured family, understood that love alone did not guarantee healing. Yet she also believed, stubbornly and quietly, in the possibility of repair. For her, adoption represented a chance to build something honest from the ground up, free from the expectations and resentments that had poisoned so many of their past connections. She imagined a home where a child was not a symbol of legacy or reputation, but a person allowed to exist without inheriting unfinished battles. In this shared vision, Bill and Katie found a rare alignment, a sense that perhaps this time, they were moving forward together rather than circling the same wounds. The process itself forced them to confront their own readiness. Every interview, every background check, every carefully worded question about their motivations peeled back layers they had spent years defending. Bill bristled at the scrutiny, unaccustomed to being evaluated rather than feared or admired. Yet beneath his irritation was a deeper anxiety, the fear that his past would disqualify him, that the world would finally hold him accountable in a way he could not outmaneuver. Katie watched him struggle with this loss of control, and recognized it as a necessary reckoning. She did not shield him from it, believing that true commitment required endurance, not shortcuts. In those moments, their partnership shifted, becoming less about reconciliation and more about mutual accountability. When they were matched with the child, the relief was almost overwhelming. The baby was fragile, quiet, carrying none of the visible drama that had defined the Spencer family for generations. Holding the child for the first time, Bill felt an unfamiliar restraint settle over him, a sense that this life did not belong to him to mold or command. It was a humbling realization, one that softened something long hardened by conflict. Katie felt it too, the cautious joy tempered by awareness, knowing that love would not be instantaneous or simple, but earned through consistency. For a brief moment, it seemed as though the family might finally step out of the shadow of its own history. That illusion shattered the moment Bill began to notice the details he had trained himself never to ignore. It was not a single revelation, but a series of unsettling recognitions, a familiar curve of the jaw, an expression that echoed a memory he had tried to bury, the dates that aligned too perfectly to dismiss. At first, he told himself he was imagining connections because of guilt, because the past had a way of resurfacing when one least expected it. But denial could not withstand the weight of truth. When the realization struck fully, it landed with devastating clarity. The child they had adopted was not just connected to their past. The baby was his blood, his grandchild, Luna's son. The shock was paralyzing. Bill, who had built his life on anticipation and strategy, found himself unprepared for the emotional freefall that followed. The adoption, which had felt like a step toward healing, was suddenly entangled in the very tragedy it had been meant to transcend. The knowledge that Luna's child had been placed into his arms without his awareness forced him to confront a cruel irony. Even in trying to move forward, he had been pulled back into the consequences of his earlier choices. The secret was not merely scandalous. It was existential, challenging everything he believed about responsibility, fate, and the boundaries between intention and outcome. Katie sensed the shift immediately. She saw it in Bill's silence, in the way his confidence collapsed inward, replaced by a heaviness that could not be explained away. When the truth emerged, it did not explode in anger or accusation. Instead, it unfolded in stunned disbelief, followed by a grief so deep it reshaped the room around them. Katie grappled with the revelation on multiple levels at once. She felt the shock of betrayal, not intentional, but devastating all the same, alongside a profound sorrow for Luna, whose suffering had extended even beyond her own life. At the same time, she was forced to question the meaning of their choice. Had they truly chosen this child freely, or had fate intervened, binding them to a responsibility they could not refuse? For Bill, the moral weight was crushing. He was no longer simply an adoptive father offering a second chance. He was a grandfather confronting the legacy of his own failures. Luna's pain, once a distant regret, now lived and breathed in the child he held. The adoption ceased to be a symbolic gesture, and became a reckoning, demanding that he face the consequences of a family line marked by power and neglect. He questioned whether he had the right to raise this child, whether love born of obligation could ever be pure. Yet alongside that doubt was an unyielding resolve. If this child carried Luna's blood, then abandoning him would be the final, unforgivable failure. Katie's internal conflict took a different shape. She wrestled with the fear that their family was once again being defined by secrets, that the very thing she had hoped to escape was now unavoidable. Yet she also recognized the strange grace embedded in the revelation. The child had not been lost to the system or raised without connection. He had been brought, unknowingly, into the care of those bound to him by blood and history. Katie began to see the adoption not as a mistake, but as a convergence, painful and imperfect, yet offering the possibility of continuity rather than erasure. Accepting that truth required courage, not just from Bill, but from herself. The decision to move forward was not immediate or easy. It demanded brutal honesty, conversations stripped of pretense, and a willingness to live with unresolved discomfort. Bill had to accept that his role was no longer about control or correction, but about presence. He could not rewrite Luna's story, but he could refuse to let her son inherit the same isolation. Katie had to accept that loving this child meant embracing a history she had every reason to resent. Together, they redefined parenthood not as an escape from the past, but as an engagement with it. As they settled into this new reality, the emotional stakes deepened. Every milestone carried layered meaning, every quiet moment shadowed by the knowledge of what had been lost and what remained. Yet within that complexity was something unexpectedly steady, a shared commitment to do better, not perfectly, but consciously. The adoption, once a symbol of fresh beginnings, became a testament to resilience, proof that even the most painful truths could coexist with love. In embracing Luna's child, Bill and Katie did not absolve themselves, or undo the damage of the past. Instead, they chose to carry it forward with intention, transforming inheritance into responsibility. The secret that could have shattered them instead forced them to confront the full scope of family, not as a source of entitlement, but as a call to accountability. And in that choice, the story shifted from one of tragedy alone to one of fragile, hard-won hope, reminding everyone watching that healing does not come from forgetting, but from facing the truth and choosing love anyway. Eric's illness arrived without ceremony, without the kind of dramatic moment that people expect when a life-changing truth first takes shape. It slipped quietly into the margins of his days, settling into the spaces between breaths, between thoughts, between the confident gestures that had once defined him. At first, it was nothing more than a persistent fatigue he could not quite explain, a sense that his body no longer answered him with the same loyalty it always had. Eric, who had built an empire on certainty and vision, told himself it was age, stress, the inevitable toll of a life lived at full speed. He had spent decades outrunning doubt, shaping fabric and futures with the same decisive hand. To admit fear now felt like surrender. Yet fear was already there, growing quietly, waiting for the moment when denial would no longer be enough. Donna noticed long before anyone else did. She noticed because she watched him in a way no one else did anymore, not with the expectation that he would always be strong, but with an attentiveness shaped by care rather than dependence. She saw the way his smile sometimes arrived a second too late, how his hand lingered on the edge of a chair, as if grounding himself before sitting down. She heard the change in his breathing when he thought no one was listening. Donna had learned, over years of loving people who carried heavy legacies, that silence often spoke louder than words. When Eric finally told her the truth, it was not dramatic. It was hesitant, almost apologetic, as though his illness were a personal failure rather than a betrayal of his own body. He spoke of strange test results, of doctors who spoke in cautious tones, of symptoms that did not yet have a name. And Donna listened, holding that secret like something fragile, knowing that once spoken aloud to the wrong ears it could shatter the delicate balance holding him together. What bound Donna to Eric in that moment was not only love, but responsibility. She understood immediately what he was asking of her without needing him to say it outright. He was asking her to help him protect the image of stability that had become synonymous with his name, to shield his family from a truth he was not ready to face himself. Donna agreed, not because she believed secrecy was right, but because she saw how deeply Eric needed time. Time to understand what was happening inside him, time to reconcile the man he had been with the vulnerability he was now forced to acknowledge. In those early days, secrecy felt like mercy. It allowed him to move through his life without the weight of pity, without the constant, searching looks that would inevitably follow once the truth was known. Donna became the keeper of his fear, the quiet witness to his moments of weakness, the person who reminded him, gently and often, that he was still himself even as his body betrayed him. As weeks turned into months, the illness began to leave more visible marks. There were days when Eric's hands trembled as he sketched designs, the lines on the page wavering where once they had been bold and sure. There were moments when his voice faltered during meetings, a brief loss of breath that he quickly masked with humor or irritation. The world around him continued to expect certainty, leadership, strength. Brooke and Ridge, immersed in their own battles and ambitions, saw only what they had always seen, Eric as the unmovable foundation of their world. They mistook his growing distance for preoccupation, his shorter temper for stress. Donna watched them from the sidelines, her heart tightening each time she saw how close they were to the truth without quite reaching it. She knew that when the secret finally surfaced, it would not arrive gently. It would explode, reshaping relationships, reopening old wounds, forcing every member of the family to confront the possibility of loss. For Eric, the hardest part was not the physical discomfort, or the uncertainty of his prognosis, but the erosion of control. His entire life had been built on the belief that he could will his way through obstacles, that determination and vision were enough to overcome any challenge. Illness did not respond to willpower. It did not negotiate. It demanded humility in a man who had spent decades defining himself through strength. In private moments with Donna, he allowed the mask to slip. He admitted his fear of becoming a burden, of being remembered not for what he had built, but for how he had declined. Donna countered these fears not with platitudes, but with presence. She reminded him that love did not diminish in the face of weakness, that legacy was not erased by vulnerability. Yet even as she spoke these truths, she felt the weight of the secret pressing down on her. She carried not only Eric's fear, but the knowledge that the longer the truth remained hidden, the more devastating its revelation would be. Brooke sensed that something was wrong long before she could articulate it. She had spent too many years navigating emotional undercurrents to ignore the subtle shifts in Eric's behavior. She noticed the way he avoided certain conversations, how he deflected questions about his health with jokes that rang hollow. Brooke's instinct was to confront, to demand honesty, but something held her back. Perhaps it was the familiarity of denial, the way families sometimes collude in pretending that nothing is wrong, because acknowledging it feels too dangerous. Ridge, too, began to feel the tension, though he interpreted it differently. He saw Eric's struggles through the lens of responsibility, worrying about the future of the company, about leadership and stability. The possibility that his father might be facing something far more serious than stress did not fully take shape until the day it could no longer be ignored. The moment of discovery did not come in a doctor's office or through a dramatic collapse, but through a small, human mistake. Donna, exhausted from carrying the secret alone, let her guard slip. A medical report, misplaced for just a moment, fell into Brooke's hands. The language was clinical, cautious, but unmistakable. Brooke's world tilted as she read it, her mind racing to reconcile the words on the page with the man she had always known. When she confronted Donna, the truth spilled out in fragments, heavy with guilt and fear. Brooke's first reaction was not anger, but devastation. The realization that Eric had been suffering in silence, that Donna had known while she remained unaware, struck her like a betrayal layered on top of impending loss. Ridge's reaction was different, sharper, fueled by a mix of fear and frustration. He struggled with the idea that his father, the man who had taught him everything he knew about strength and leadership, had chosen secrecy over trust. Ridge felt excluded, powerless, confronted by the possibility that there were limits even to his ability to protect the people he loved. When he finally faced Eric, the confrontation was charged with unspoken emotion. Eric, weakened but resolute, met his son's anger with honesty at last. He spoke of fear, of pride, of the desire to remain himself for as long as possible. He admitted that he had been wrong to believe he could shoulder the burden alone, but also defended his need for dignity. In that moment, the illness ceased to be just a medical issue. It became a mirror reflecting every unresolved dynamic within the family. The revelation forced Brooke and Ridge to confront their own fears of loss. Brooke, who had built her life around connection and emotional honesty, was haunted by the thought that she might lose Eric without ever truly understanding what he had been going through. She grappled with guilt, replaying every moment she had dismissed his behavior as stress or distraction. Her instinct was to draw closer, to compensate for lost time with overwhelming care. Yet she quickly realized that Eric did not need to be smothered by concern. He needed respect, understanding, and the space to define how he wanted to face his illness. Brooke's challenge became learning how to support, without controlling, to love without turning his condition into the center of her own fear. Ridge, meanwhile, found himself confronting a different kind of vulnerability. He had always seen himself as the successor, the one who would carry the torch forward. Eric's illness forced him to imagine a future where that transition was not theoretical but imminent. The weight of expectation pressed down on him, tangled with grief and unresolved resentment. He was forced to question whether his drive to take over was rooted in ambition or fear, whether he was prepared to honor his father's legacy without erasing the man behind it. The illness exposed fault lines that had long existed, bringing them to the surface with painful clarity. Donna's role shifted once the secret was out. No longer the sole guardian of Eric's truth, she became a bridge between him and the rest of the family. She faced her own reckoning, enduring Brooke's hurt and Ridge's suspicion while holding fast to the knowledge that her intentions had been rooted in love. Donna struggled with guilt, wondering whether she had enabled Eric's denial for too long, whether her desire to protect him had inadvertently caused more pain. Yet as the family began to navigate this new reality together, her quiet strength emerged as a stabilizing force. She understood that illness did not just affect the body, it reshaped relationships, forcing everyone involved to renegotiate their roles. As Eric's condition progressed, moments of clarity alternated with periods of weakness. There were days when he felt almost like himself, his mind sharp, his creativity undiminished. On those days, he insisted on working, on being present, on reminding everyone that he was still capable. And there were days when the weight of uncertainty pressed too heavily, when he withdrew, exhausted not only by physical symptoms, but by the emotional labor of being watched. The family learned, slowly and imperfectly, how to adapt. They learned that support did not always mean intervention, that love sometimes required restraint. The possibility of loss hung over every interaction, unspoken but ever present. It infused ordinary moments with heightened significance, turning shared meals into quiet rituals, conversations into opportunities for connection. Brooke found herself cherishing small gestures she had once taken for granted, a smile, a shared memory, a moment of laughter. Ridge began to listen more, to ask questions he had never thought to ask before, seeking to understand not just the leader his father had been, but the man he was now. Eric, aware of this shift, felt both comforted and unsettled. He was grateful for the closeness, yet wary of being reduced to his illness. His greatest fear remained becoming an object of pity rather than a participant in his own life. In facing that fear, Eric made a choice. He decided to speak openly, not about medical details or prognoses, but about his wishes, his values, his hopes for the family he would one day leave behind. These conversations were not easy. They forced Brooke and Ridge to confront the reality of a future without him, to imagine the world reshaped by his absence. Yet they also offered a kind of peace, grounding the family in shared understanding rather than unspoken dread. Through these moments, Eric reclaimed a measure of control, redefining strength not as invulnerability, but as honesty. The illness, mysterious and unresolved, became a catalyst rather than a conclusion. It stripped away illusions, revealing the raw connections that bound the family together. It exposed vulnerabilities long hidden beneath pride and ambition, forcing each person to confront not only the possibility of loss, but the meaning of presence. Donna, Brooke, and Ridge each found themselves changed by the experience, their relationships reshaped by the shared weight of fear and love. And Eric, standing at the center of it all, discovered that even as his body faltered, his influence endured. Not in the empire he had built, but in the courage with which he faced the unknown, and in the quiet, unyielding bond that held his family together in the shadow of loss. In the end, the illness did not define Eric's story, but it illuminated it. It revealed the depth of his humanity, the strength that lay not in control, but in connection. As the family moved forward, uncertain of what the future would bring, they carried with them the understanding that love, once tested by fear, emerged stronger, more honest, and more enduring. The risk of loss remained, ever present, but so did the resolve to face it together, not in silence, but in shared courage.